everyone. And welcome to Photography Allowed, Changing Museum Public Photography Policies. In the decades since the release of the first iPhone, photography, video, sharing, and live streaming have become everyday activities. How have museums adapted, or still need to adapt, their public photography policies and procedures in this time? Blanket prohibitions on photography by the public in collections-based museums have begun to disappear, and museums are beginning to ask how they can work toward meeting the expectations of the public by allowing, or even by encouraging, photography and the creation of user-generated content in their museums. So this panel will speak to the challenges of changing policies and practices concerning public photography, examining a range of considerations from copyright and IP to privacy rights, collection safety, visitor safety, contractual restrictions in special exhibitions, and social media. So each of our panelists here will present on a slightly different facet of the issue, and we'll take some questions at the end as well. So we'll be looking at policy changes, museum photography and the public, photography and special exhibitions, and social media policies. So my name's Melissa Fournier, and I'm head of imaging services and IP at the Yale Center for British Art, and I've been pleased to co-organize this session with my colleague John French. We're chairs of MCN's Intellectual Property Special Interest Group, and if these topics are of interest to you, please join us in our SIG. So I'll tell you a little more about each of our speakers just up front right now, and then we'll get right to it. So Kristin Britanik is the manager of rights and digital collections at the Andy Warhol Museum, where she oversees the digitization program and assists in navigating the intellectual property rights issues inherent to the museum's eclectic collection. Sriba Kwadjovie is the Senior Intellectual Property Associate at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where she manages copyright and licensing for a variety of digital and print media platforms, exhibitions, and events organized by the museums. She's also a freelance dancer and choreographer performing with Bay Area-based modern and contemporary companies. John French is Director of Visual Resources at the Yale University Art Gallery, where he oversees workflow, design, color management, and long-term archiving of images and data. Additionally, he's been actively involved in the development and deployment of the university's digital asset management system and in the implementation of the university's open access policy. And Ann Young is the manager of rights and reproductions at the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields. Young was formerly the photographic archivist for the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University, and she's worked for the Art Gallery of Ontario and the George Eastman House. She's currently a Master of Jurisprudence candidate at Indiana University's Robert McKinney School of Law, focusing on intellectual property, art, and museum law. So our first speaker is Kristin.
Hello, everybody. When we first got together and we started talking about potential topics for this talk, I jumped at the chance to talk about policy changes over time, because at the Warhol Museum within the last year and a half, we had completely changed our photo policy. And then as I started to think more generally about photo policies in museums, I realized how much it really fit into this MCN's broader theme of looking back, thinking forward, and taking action. So as I started to structure this talk, I realized that photography in museums can kind of be divided into two eras. That's BDC, before digital cameras, and after digital cameras. So I was thinking, you know, visitors have probably been taking photos in museums as long as personal cameras have been available. There's a really embarrassing photo of me at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History when I was about 5 years old that my grandmother took with a disposable camera. But if you think about it, with the early personal cameras, it was a lot of work to capture these images, to develop them, and to share them. It was a physical process. Not only did you have to take the photo, you didn't know if it was going to be a great photo right away, because you had to make the decision to then develop the film, and then you had the print, and what were you going to do with that print? You maybe tucked it in a family album, kept it in the little envelope that you got the print back from. So distribution wasn't nearly as wide. And because of this limited dissemination of photography taken in museums, it was a little bit less of a concern, especially in the context, and one of the things that plagues the Warhol Museum with intellectual property rights, kind of people taking these images and using them for other things. The uses were much more personal. Also, cameras, maybe wasn't something that you had with you all the time, like right now with a digital camera and a cell phone. Everybody has them with them all the time, so the experience at a museum was different. If you think about, security of people backing up and bumping into an artwork, taking photos wasn't as much of a daily activity as it is today. And also, like I was saying before about, more affordable personal cameras, like the era of disposable cameras, those photos, the quality wasn't that great. They were terrible. It was hard to get things together. So because of that, museum photo policies maybe weren't as cemented. And some of my co-panelists are going to get into various factors and reasons for having photography or not having photography that they're going to go into a little bit more. But definitely in the past, things were different. So looking now at the era of digital cameras, and digital cameras is one thing that came out in the early 2000s where they started to get better and cheaper, which is another big factor is, the technology is getting better. What you can snap with a personal camera, the quality is higher. You can take more photos. And this little graphic right here, it's a data graphic. It was published in the New York Times. The research was done by InfoTrends. And if you look, the little blue bars is the portion of photos that are be taken with cell phones. So, that's growing rapidly. People aren't using these digital cameras that came out in the early 2000s anymore. And it was estimated that there's, the number of digital images that exist in the world today are just growing so rapidly. So, like I was saying, it's now easier than ever to take quality photographs. You always have your camera with you. And also, there's this new trend of people documenting their everyday lives visually and then sharing it on social media. So all of this kind of these changes happening in the digital landscape all had a big impact on us at the Andy Warhol Museum. So we're kind of unique in that hopefully a lot of you were able to attend the reception last night at the Warhol Museum, and you have to know that out of everything in the galleries right now, we own the copyright to 5 photographs that are hanging right now. And most of the Warhol artwork, the copyright is owned by the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, which is a separate entity from us, and we have a partnership with them, but they have very specific ideas with how digital images of Warhol's artwork is distributed. There's also other known photographers. Some of them are still living, some of them are still represented by studios, and things like that. So because of this, we are very hyper aware of intellectual property concerns and visitors coming and taking photos and what happens to those photos after. And it leads to a lot of confusion. So I actually have this really nice anecdote that highlights the confusion about our photo policy. So I said a year and a half ago, we changed, we now allow photography. And after we allow photography, Steve Martin came to our museum, which was really exciting, and he posted this lovely tweet that said, "Expert curation at the lively Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh tells Andy's story succinctly and beautifully." So what a lovely tweet by Steve Martin. And then somebody replies to him, and it says, "I agree." It's run by a friend. They know someone at the museum. He's like, "I'm not a fan of the no pictures rule," which actually was false because that was old information. And then Steve Martin replies, "Oops, I didn't know about the no pictures rule. Hey, there's a knock at my door," joking that we're coming to knock at our door and yell at him for taking this photograph. So I think this series of tweets perfectly highlights kind of the transition we had gone through and the changes. So the museum opened in 1994 here in Pittsburgh, and from 1994 to 2013, we had this nebulous photography policy. I tried really hard to find some, dig up some old written policy, and it was generally no photography, but it was not strictly enforced at all. The gallery attendants didn't really know what to do. Special exhibitions, which we'll get into a little bit later, some of them did allow photography, so the messaging was never really clear. So then in 2013, it was decided that from some things that happened at the Warhol Foundation that the messaging had to be clear. And was that we decided to codify our policy and say, okay, no photography, you know, and a lot of different stakeholders in the museum got together. It was for a variety of reasons, for protection of the collection. People are really distracted. Also, you know, looking at the year 2013, these iPhones and digital cameras are now ubiquitous. And also, because of intellectual property right concerns, that was like one of the primary drivers, is the Warhol Foundation wasn't really comfortable with having photography in the museum, so we decided not to have it. And also, it kind of gave the museum a little more control of how their collection was presented in the world, was one of the arguments for it. You know, but that was in 2013, and that was by far, if you go onto Yelp or any kind of reviewing system, the #1 visitor complaint was like, I went there and I couldn't take a photo. And it's Warhol, you know, he was a prolific photographer himself. He was known for, like, you know, taking and borrowing and appropriating other works. So it was kind of like this really confusing messages. And so some things happened in August of 2016, a little before August of 2016, and the Andy Warhol Foundation kind of gave on their policy a little. So we had this opportunity, it coincided with the opening of this exhibition of Andy Warhol in Ai Weiwei, to allow photography in the museums, and it was kind of this radical thing for us. So our new policy is that photography is now permitted, but it's for private and personal, non-commercial use only. We still don't allow things that might endanger the collection, such as tripods, selfie sticks, and we don't allow any video unless, you know, you go through our department for a specific plan. And our second floor is always a rotating special exhibition, and that, again, is handled by a case-by-case basis, although now we actively try to work with our lenders. If anyone was there yesterday, the current exhibition had 11 lenders we had to coordinate, and fortunately, all of them were on board with photography, so we were able to do that. So it's something we work a little more to make the museum completely open to photography now. So lessons learned. Overall, like I said, it's been a year and a half. The response, especially from visitors, has been very positive. No major incidents of anyone bumping into anything. No major complaints from copyright holders, knock on wood. I think I just jinxed myself. And also, it does seem to generate more interest in visiting the museum, which is really exciting. You know, because it's 2017 and there's that expectation. So the challenges, you guys know, you can't enforce for personal use only. It's going everywhere. They're going on Twitter, they're going on Instagram. This leads to some staff frustration that visitors can do more on social media than they can because our staff is beholden to some copyright holders and restrictions that visitors aren't, so it's very hard for them to work with. So in conclusion, I wasn't totally involved with developing the policy, but I kind of had these questions that came up as we were considering things of what to take into account when you're revisiting your own photo policy, what type of collections, intellectual property rights, obligations to lenders, how do you plan to enforce it, and what is your museum's mission and how does it work into your museum's mission? So thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Sriba Kwadjovie, and as I was introduced, I manage intellectual property at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. I recently had a title change, but that was prior to being a part of this panel, so I'm now the intellectual property manager, yay. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is a little bit different. I'm going to talk about how museums, some of the policies around how we photograph the public or visitors when they come into our institution. A lot of colleagues that I work with, and I'm sure in your respective museums, want engaging photos of visitors coming to the museum, looking at artwork. I know that in recent years, at least at SFMOMA, there's been more of a shift towards highlighting visitor engagement as part of our marketing materials and a lot of the digital marketing ads that we produce. Instead of just showing strictly artwork in its full view, we want to show visitors engaging with artwork, how they're relating to the artwork that they see. And so this highlights an issue with the right of publicity. So just a little bit of a background. The rights of publicity are governed by state law. So depending on what museum or institution you work for, if you want to learn more about the rights of publicity, look towards the state law in your state. In California, where we're located, the right of publicity is governed by California Civil Code 3344, which is a living person statute, and then 3344.1, which is a post-mortem statute. And that's another thing, California, because we have Hollywood, we have a lot of celebrities, so our the legislator enacted a statute for persons after they die, how we can use their publicity rights as well. And that is also governed by state. So you can check to see if your state has a law on post-mortem publicity rights. And I love the fact that we're talking about Andy Warhol, because as you just mentioned, he was a big appropriation artist. As we know, he was very much into popular culture and celebrity culture, and he appropriated a lot of celebrity images in his artwork. So there's a bit of irony in all of this, in talking about the right of publicity, but nonetheless, it's something that we definitely pay attention to. So moving forward, when you have visitors that come into your space, into the museum or institution, an individual has a right to control his or her identity for commercial purposes. So that includes name, that includes your image, your actual face. Typically, it has to be recognizable or discernible features. So as you see in this lovely photo, family day photo that was taken at the museum, we have a mother-daughter duo posing for the camera. Very discernible faces. We can recognize the mother's face, the daughter's face, and these are definitely situations where if we wanted to use this image in a public-facing platform such as our website or in marketing materials, we would definitely want to know what is the status. Has the adult signed a model release form for herself as well as for her daughter? So the model release. This is an example of our current model release that we use for both adults and minors. We typically use a model release form when we have a small event, or as you can see in the previous photo, they're posing for the camera. It's two individuals. We also use the model release where it is feasible to do so, and I'll get into a little bit when it's not so feasible. But where we have, like I said, a small event, limited number of people, or it's a staged event, maybe we're doing a photo shoot and we've hired models to come in and set a stage. We definitely want to make sure that we have a model release on file. And again, children is a very important, anytime we're showing faces of children in particular, we really want to make sure that we have some kind of release on file by either the parent or guardian of the child. And our model releases are pretty broad. I mean, they encompass just about everything we want to do as a museum institution where this image could be found in any media, now or in the future. It's a pretty broad release. And if you have questions about language, you can come speak to me afterwards. So what do we do when we have events where we can't? It's just not practical to go after every single individual and get them to sign a model release. So this comes up a lot because we have major big events. We have our Modern Ball event attended by hundreds of people. And so it's just not physically possible to run up to each and every individual and get a model release from them. So usually in these situations, we will have event signage that is posted conspicuously throughout the event where we think that most people are likely to come and see this signage. And we try to make it fun. We're letting people know that if you come into this space, you consent to being photographed or videotaped, and that you basically license your image to us for any purposes, again, no now or in the future. And if you don't want your image to be used, come find one of our staff members and let us know. And in this case, sometimes at these event signage, you will get people who have very discernible faces in the photo. Sometimes it's just a side view or a profile. It really depends, but this signage is meant to encompass any type of image taken. And so this is just a slide of an example of some of the photos that we capture at our various events. There's also some strategic elements to it as well. As you can see, the individual that's standing in front of the Rothko. That's a photo where, we may, if we didn't have a model release on file for that individual, it may, highlight may, it may be okay to use this photo because you cannot see the individual's face. It's the backside. So this might be an example if I get a question about image use, is this okay? And this is apart from the Rothko that's in the photo too, but just speaking about publicity rights at this point, I would say, well, do we have a model release on file? No, it was event signage, or no, I don't remember, we don't quite know what happened. Then I say, well, this might be a case or it might be okay, because you can't really immediately recognize who this person is. However, if you look at the photo on this side, where we have a child, and we also have a photo of the artist, that's Mark DeSuvero, that would be an example where before we use it in any marketing materials or any public-facing platforms, we'd want to make sure that we have some model release information on file. And one other thing I'd like to highlight, I think that's my last slide. We had an interesting situation that came up recently with the Noguchi Playscape work that's situated right outside our building premises. And I think one of my colleagues saw an adult with a child, and they were coming through on the premises, and they saw the Noguchi Playscape, and it's one of those works that you can actually touch and play on. And we wanted to get a photo of it. We thought it was a great opportunity to show a child, and a child playing on a playscape, right? What it's intended for. We did. We got the model release. The grandmothers, it turns out, signed it. So, we had it. We took the photos. We thought everything was great. Well, the next day we get a phone call from the mother, and the mother was not so pleased and said that the grandmother did not have authorization to sign a release on the granddaughter's behalf. So one thing to also keep in mind is sometimes these model releases are they can be worth the paper that they're printed on, depending if there's an extraneous situation that comes up later and you get a call or some information from a parent or guardian that does not want the use of the photo in any materials. So just to keep that in mind, that sometimes other situations may come up and you could say, yes, we have a release on file and an adult signed it, but at the same time, whatever their situation was, we want to be mindful of it for ourselves. So we ended up deleting those photos despite the fact of having an adult sign on behalf of the child. So, every situation is unique and different, so just something to keep in mind. Thank you.
Hello, I'm John French. I'm going to speak a little bit about photography and special exhibition spaces. I think we're all familiar with this idea of photography not being allowed in special exhibitions, but I find it a little surprising in 2017 that this is what we're here talking about. But part of what I think happens is there's confusion for our visitors and even for our own staff when we're looking at where we permit photography, where we don't permit photography, what we permit and how we permit it. And to kind of start off, I pulled together a variety of slides of signs that we found in various exhibition spaces that run the full gamut, are printed on tickets. It's an international symposium. Some try to be fun, but part of what I often find interesting is that idea of no photography is often kind of buried in your language, so it makes it confusing for your visitor to see why you're not permitting photography, or even if you are permitting photography. And so some of the main arguments, if you start looking against why museums as a whole don't permit photography, but particularly in special exhibitions, are this idea of intellectual property, which was covered a little bit earlier today, but the loan agreements may have certain restrictions within there that say that because you don't own the artwork, we don't want you to let your visitors use this imagery, or there may be privacy rights as well. There's often the conservation issues that come up, that concern of the damage to works, the flash photography of works, the potential risk of concern of people tripping over objects while they're taking photography. And then there's revenue streams, which I think is maybe one of the bigger arguments of why often we don't want that. We put a lot of money into special exhibitions. We pay high loan fees. We want to then commercialize a little bit and try to regain some of our money off of that. So there's this concept that if we don't allow people to take pictures, we're going to send them into our gift shop, and that's where we're going to get our revenue. But I really think we're looking at two different routes. There are people who are taking images kind of for their self-use, and the group of people that are still looking in the gift shop to try to find what they want. And then maybe tied in with that is that aesthetic of the experience. So as a visitor, you're wanting to go through an exhibition. Are you wanting to be able to actually look at the artwork and not worry about people trying to fight in front of you to take photos? Are we, as curators and people who are trying to present information to our public, attempting to really get people to look at the artwork, not just take a picture, run, and go to the next thing, which is often the case. And then finally, the security idea, this concept of the security guards then having to kind of watch and say, are people taking photos in a place they're not supposed to be? And so their interest is focused on that person that took the one picture and trying to chase them around to be sure they're not taking more, but also stumbling over, artwork into it. So what I've found with museums is we often have two different policies. We say, in our museum, you can take pictures, you can share pictures, you can do anything you want to do, but in this special exhibition space, you can't take pictures, or you can't take pictures of these 3 paintings, and make sure you look for the little symbol that tells you you can't take these pictures. So I think we need to work a little bit on this mixed message idea of what are we allowing you to do in the main museum? What are we allowing you to do in special exhibitions? And ideally, you should just have one consistent message that is coming across and working out how you're going to share that information. So touching on one of the topics that often seems to come up is the idea of flash photography, and that using flash photography is going to in some way damage the artwork. If you do research and you look out there, there have been several studies that have already been done that are clearly showing that flash photography is not damaging the artwork any more than its general exposure to a natural environment. The larger issue clearly is the distraction of the flashes going off, which is disrupting the viewer experience. So I think partly it's even a matter of trying to train our staff that are in there that the reason is not because this flash is going to damage artwork, but it's disruptive to viewers, and trying to educate people as to why we have policies we have. Potentially the bigger the stick that I'm finding is that we're often working with these old legacy loan agreements. We're working either with museums that just have this language in there from years and years ago that they haven't reviewed or they haven't updated because it's so intermeshed with other language that they would need to be working with legal counsel to update their loan agreements. So one of the things I would say is that those of you that are in the fields like we are, is you really need to start pushing and working towards working either with your registrar, who often are the people who are controlling these loan documents, or with your legal counsel to review and update the language that you have within your loan agreements and really try to start stripping out this idea of not permitting photography and allowing the photography, or at least being very clear into what you allow the museum to do versus what you allow the viewers to do, and make that a clear distinction and make sure that that's communicated out. I find it's better to put the statement in similar to what we have, that we allow public to take photography in our exhibition spaces, versus putting in a yes-no agreement, because if you put in kind of the affirmative, this is what we allow, more people are going to read that and say, okay, that's what their policy is, versus having to make a distinction. At most, they can cross through the line and say, we don't agree with this, cross it off and say no and move on. But moving that in there is part of this. And again, I think it's part of our work as the community to push this out. There are some trends that are coming out that I think are interesting. This research just came out a couple of weeks ago, actually. Wasn't done and designed specifically for museums, but the article did reference this, that there's new technology coming out that is allowing LED lighting systems to actually disrupt your camera sensor. And what it's doing is, as you see visually here, putting lines within the image. So it's not prohibiting somebody from taking the picture, but it's prohibiting them from doing anything with it because the sensor is getting messed with. This research was done more in a means of areas where you're potentially doing some sort of research and you don't want that type of stuff out. But you know, it may be a route where you really could look at going if you were saying, we're a museum that we don't want to have to be bothered to police this, we're going to work in this fashion or in this direction, we're going to put this type of lighting in. So I would encourage you, if you can see it there, and if not, our slides will be online, to read this article. It was interesting to see. Lastly, my big thing is just try to be clear in your communication of what it is you do. Make sure your signage is clear, what people can do, and if you're encouraging photography, what you want them to do with it. Anne's going to speak about social media in just a moment, but how you want them to do that, the hashtag you want them to do, but you know, also what don't you permit? You know, we don't permit selfie sticks, or we don't permit drones. Anne will lovely talk about drones, I'm sure. But on your websites, also make it very clear what your policy is. Make sure this information is being kept up to date and that people have access to that. And with that, I will pass it to Anne and her drones.
All right. Sadly, I didn't bring my drone with me today. Oh, sorry. So I'm going to be shifting gears a little bit from talking about photography policies to what instituting photography policies and opening up our institutions to allow more visitor photography has led to, which is the need for, yet again, a new type of institutional policy, your social media policy. But before I get into that, I'm going to do a little bit of an IP lesson. You know, you couldn't get out of here with me and not have that. So social media, fair use. Show of hands. Fair use, yes? No? Let your rights manager deal with it? Only seeing a couple of hands, yes? All right, there's a few of you. So remembering that fair use, and it says it right here in the statute, is not an infringement of copyright. So keep that in mind while we're talking about all of these social media uses. And remember, fair use, it typically doesn't bite. It might be a little nip, but it's not going to really come back to bite you, especially when we're talking with social medias. And so the statute specifically allows for these provisions and where you can apply and utilize fair use in a number of situations. And you're going to utilize the 4 factors to make your fair use determinations in any uses. And remember, you don't have to satisfy all 4 of those factors in order to have a fair use. As we've already discussed some today, right of privacy. Where this applies as an institution and as a museum professional, though, is especially when we're talking about social media and wanting to perhaps repost visitor-generated content. And remember, in thinking about it, do you have the right to take that? Do you have the right to capture that? Do you have the right to repost that? Simplest way to remember right of privacy is someone's right to be left alone. No eavesdropping. So keeping all of that in mind, a few ways that we as institutions and as individuals can best leverage content and strengthen our fair use determinations is through attribution. And while attribution is not a legal requirement of copyright law, it is something that is going to help strengthen any fair use arguments and stances that we might be taking. But that attribution can be a credit. it can be a challenge for us to include that credit. And this is where museum professionals have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to set a good example for our visitors about how and where they can include caption and copyright credit information. And especially thinking you can all now put your 280 characters to really great use. You can get that copyright and credit line included with your tweets. And so social media as an institution is integral to now our practices and integral to our photography policies, because it's continuing to evolve and encourage and sharing these experiences, that it's moved beyond suddenly having no photography or photography in loud, but now we're seeing signs, photography encouraged, share your experiences, and here's the hashtag, and encouraging that engagement. So all of that as background, how many of your institutions have a social media policy? Okay, more than I actually expected, so yay, that's good. I did bring copies of Newfield's social media policy. I'm happy to share that with anyone as well. For those of you who have a social media policy, how familiar are you with it? Do you really know what it covers? So at Newfields, we were very strategic that our social media policy cover not only the social media as the institution, but also social media for individuals who work at the institution, and being able to outline those distinguishing differences between the two. So remember that when you are posting as an individual, that you are you're not your institution. Don't go off and start creating rogue branded accounts that then your social media manager or online content manager is going to be having to track down years from now and figure out who created this. Don't create rogue hashtags if there's already one for the exhibition. And use social media to leverage our unique views, opportunities, and expertise to the public. You want to use all of this with that caveat that as museum professionals, we are often privy to information that is still a secret, that is maybe years in the works. Like, I don't know, rebranding your institution. Or you have a new exhibition coming. And often these things are going to still be private, but you're going to be privy to that information as a museum professional. So when in doubt, ask. Last thing you want is the angry registrar coming down the office to find you in your office. Now, all aspects of a very detailed social media policy can be distilled into these guidelines that can be quickly disseminated to our staff and shared. And remember, when you're posting as a museum professional, you are part of that visitor experience. So set a good example. Keep your selfie sticks in your drones. Keep my eye on John over here with his drone coming out. That you're wanting to set a good example for our public and for our visitors, and how they too, when they come to our institutions, can photograph inside of our institutions, post on social media. Because at the end of the day, our photography policies and our social media interactions are a means of visitor engagement to capture moments and make memories, as I've done with some of my favorite little models here. Thank you.
So thank you, everyone. Do we have any questions for our panelists? Yes.
I noticed on one of the slides, an image was noted as excerpt, which meant, I assume that means it was cropped. But I assume it means cropped. But whether that was cropped or not, does an image that is good for fair use, bad to be cropped, because fair use does not negate the artist's moral rights? Did I lose you?
I'm not looking
Moral
towards the two
rights of
lawyers.
the artist, you cannot change the form of the work.
Oh, see if I can stretch this over here. Okay. Well, first I would say the United States does not have moral rights. So that would be one place to start. Are you talking about publicity rights?
Moral rights.
There's no federal laws in the United States for moral rights. The closest we get is the Visual Artists' Rights Act, but that is not the same as actual moral rights in, as you might find in European countries. So there's that. But fair use, the amount or percentage of a work that is used in utilizing a crop or a detail would only be one of those 4 factors towards a fair use. So utilization of a crop or something would not necessarily undermine artist's original intent.
SFMOMA case with this big installation that was incomplete that the artist sued the moral rights, but I could very well be wrong.
Was that the physical installation of the piece? Yeah, that's different than
That's,
representation.
yeah, that's,
It's different from a photo.
Yeah, because VARA applies to the actual physical.
yeah.
Well, that's what I'm asking, that's actually what I'm asking, whether the moral rights, which I believe, at least in some states, does apply to certainly any modification of the original work.
The work it's,
That's what I'm trying to be clear about.
yeah, correct. Yeah, VARA does not necessarily apply to digital representations of works or photographs of them. It's the actual work itself.
But to your point, just a little bit on the use of cropping, because this is an issue that comes up a lot within the museum that I work for also. You know, depending on the context that you're using the cropped material for, that could also be a factor, depending on how you're using it. So for example, if we were going to use a crop of, let's just say Andy Warhol, you know, a work by Andy Warhol, we wanted to crop it, include overtype across the image and use it on a marketing material that then got disseminated in print or in digital platforms. That type of use, it's quite possible the foundation would come to us if we hadn't asked for permission for that specific modification of that use of the artwork image. So that is something we're very mindful, even if there isn't a specific statute that deals with that issue. Museums are very sensitive to those issues, because we understand that artists and their estates some are very particular about how you reproduce an artwork image. A lot of what we do in reproducing artwork images falls under derivative. It's a derivative of that artwork, and so how we're treating that image, there are rights in that, and so if we're cropping it, that could be seen as a modification of the artwork in its reproduction. So we do try to, or I know we do reach out to artists and their estates or whoever the rights holders are anytime we want to crop an artwork, especially if it's being used for a promotional or commercial purpose. If it's being used more for education and we want to use a detail to highlight a particular aspect of that artwork, then that may be seen differently, and that may come under a fair use approach. And again, fair use is really a defense to copyright infringement. And so a lot of times those determinations won't be assessed until you get into litigation. But you know, we also use the word as a way to say, oh, we're taking a fair use of. But you know, what that really means is usually not assessed until you get to that point in an action.
I would say some things they don't necessarily fall under the law, but it's about relationship management, whether it's the relationship with our lenders, our donors, the artist estates, or with our visitors. And so we often have to, you know, take all of these things into account when the law doesn't necessarily guide us in that area.
I'd also like to echo Sriba and Melissa's sentiments that just because it doesn't fall into our law, our general image use policy doesn't really allow for color changes, text overlay, or cropping without permission from the rights holders. And also we kind of see it as we don't really want to misrepresent the collection too much. If it's really modified, like if people are doing color changes and then doing marketing pieces with that, you know, and people come to the museum and it looks really different, we like to keep the essence of the artwork and the original image as well, so.
Let's see I don't know who got their hand up first. We'll start on this side. Go ahead.
So to that point, do any of your institutions regulate to take like ask people to put the material down if they are violating, especially if you don't have rights to the material? Do you have like searches
Oh, if I had the staff. Really, the only place that we're looking for this is more from if somebody is in violation of, we say that visitor photography is for personal, non-commercial use. So occasionally we've had cases where somebody, clearly was at the museum as a visitor, just taking pictures on their own, and they've now put their pictures up on a stock photo site and are trying to sell them. And we come to know them. Usually, we've got various Google alerts set up and things. Usually is how that's found. On occasion, we've had a couple instances where other museums have stumbled upon things and going, did you guys put this up? This doesn't seem right. Or we've occasionally had a couple companies that have come to us that found out. We had one case, actually, of all things, with rolled gold pretzels, where they thought they were just licensing a picture of a pretty mansion, and come to find out it was somebody had been visiting the museum, taken a photograph of the Lily House estate, and was selling the image on a stock site. We're like, well, we're private property, and you can't actually see that mansion from the street, so you can't turn around and be profiting and making money off of that. So, that was a point where then we did reach out to that stock site and to the photography. It was also kind of a sketchy stock photography site that didn't require model or property releases, which that's a whole other issue. But as far as like regular visitors and their social media accounts, that we're really not policing that. Because again, we're really more trying to encourage that engagement with our visitors.
Yeah, we also, if you go onto our website and you go on to visit SFMOMA, we do have a section that explains when you come into the gallery what your rights are, what you can do as far as photographing artworks in the gallery. So we highly encourage that visitors visit our website to get that information about our policies around that, and also on the ticket that we print out. We have, when you receive a ticket to a museum, it's essentially a license that you're obtaining in relationship with the museum. And on there, we do say, photography is permitted where we allow it. We have some special exhibitions that may not permit photography, but where it is allowed, you can use images for personal, non-commercial use. What's considered personal these days is a little open-ended. I think with social media, one could argue that is personal use. You're not using it necessarily to promote or a commercial purpose. You just want to share with family and friends. So a lot of it is very kind of up in the air. But we really, the onus is on the person taking the photo to assess what, if any, further rights clearances are needed, depending on how they're planning to use it.
Justina? And then
I have a question about model releases and changing the culture within an institution, especially in education, which may or may not be used to using model releases, and because oftentimes they're interested in documenting things for a grant, which doesn't need a release, but then not being conscious of the fact that that same image could end up being used in marketing. And so the model release then becomes this hot potato in terms of who's responsible, who keeps it, who's supposed to get it. And I was wondering how you guys deal with this in terms of where the model release is kept. Obviously, if you have a dam, there's a way to link it to a model release, but if you don't have a dam, and then sort of being able to parcel out which images are okay, which images are not okay, and is there different levels of releases for different things, and because it sort of does become a hot potato within the institution in terms of who's responsible for what, and then obviously if you have a problem, then nobody wants to deal with it. So I was just wondering how you all deal with that.
Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Take a little bit of it. At the Yale Art Gallery, we have a documentation photographer whose sole job it is to work in the exhibition gallery spaces and at events and such. And it is her responsibility to have those signed, and then those are carried over, signed and then scanned into PDFs and stored that way. We at the gallery also have signage in the front that kind of is saying, you know, by participating in the gallery spaces, your image may be captured and used in some cases. If we're doing a marketing campaign, we make sure that we actually have a signed release in hand and show that image to that person. So even if we've gotten the model release, we still do due diligence to go back to those people and say, we want to use this image in this way and make sure we have their permission, because we'd rather them not be surprised to suddenly see themselves. So we really watch how we're using those, you know, more loose images on social media, Instagram or Facebook or things like that, where somebody's in the gallery, and again, try to more so almost keep their backs or their sides so that they're not as identifiable. So there's a fair amount for us of image editing that we really have to go through to call what do we put out in the public versus maybe something one of our staff using a talk presentation that has a totally different audience.
I was told by our legal department that those signs actually will not hold up.
I didn't hear what. Oh.
So they say that it's not something illegal, but that those signs, it's like it's a courtesy, but if it actually went to trial, they would not hold up in court. So like it's a courtesy for visitors to know, but obviously they can say, well, we didn't see any signs, or we didn't read them. So,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the example that I gave at the end, where we had a model release for a child, and it turns out that, you know, the parent or the mother, you know, didn't said that the grandmother wasn't authorized. Well, the museum had no way of knowing that. We did act in good faith in going out and getting the model release. But again, you know, there may be situations that come up that, you know, as a museum institution, what position do you want to take? Do you want to hold on, you know, to the contractual language in the agreement, or do you want to just say, okay, we understand, we'll delete the photos and just move forward? But you're right. I mean, that there could be a situation where we have an event and the signage is there, maybe the person didn't see it, and then all of a sudden they're seeing themselves on marketing materials, and then what? And so, as John said, you know, if we're going to do a major marketing campaign, then we probably would take that extra step of reaching back out to that individual or individuals and saying, hey, we'd like to use your image. We don't want you to be surprised. Do we have, and maybe even sign a separate agreement for that particular use of their likeness.
Alex?
Yeah, so Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms have terms of use that often try to claim some type of license as you post it. I know, for example, Facebook, it's when you post an image, you get like infinite and perpetuity licensing to Facebook to use it, right? Have your institutions thought at all about that policy? I know the Wikimedia Foundation will only put public domain CC0 or stuff we own on our social media threads because we don't want to be in the position of like relicensing someone else's work.
So this is something we have thought about because of the directives we get from the Andy Warhol Foundation, and because of that, they only allow us to post images online that are 475 pixels longest edge. So it's so tiny that they kind of consider it, you know, no one's really going to be able to repurpose or use that, including Facebook. Or, and for that reason, because of Instagram, we only do installation shots because we can't resize to force it. It can't meet our standards in a clean, neat way. So it's something we have thought about, and it's mostly driven by our directive by the Andy Warhol Foundation to post at such a small size.
I like all these different. It's so rich. Yeah. So that's one thing when third-party hosted sites, right, like Facebook and Instagram, they have their own terms of use, and so that has always been something that we are very mindful of in our engagement with these platforms. That we are essentially giving a license to Facebook, Instagram, all of these social media platforms to then reproduce this image. And we're basically saying that we have the rights to enable this, that we have the rights to grant you this license. So it's a pretty big responsibility, and it's something that we wrestle with constantly. But we, like Anne, we have social media policies around, you know, the size of the image that we put online, how we depict it, maybe like you said, it's an installation shot as opposed to the full view of an artwork or a high-res photo of it. Yeah, there's.
Yeah, and I would say to that too, that's a large area where in some areas, and this totally gets into a gray area, where there's maybe some questioning and we're maybe not comfortable posting some of that content ourselves, but it's still maybe an area where we allow visitor photography throughout our entire campus. So there might be a really cool shot that a visitor posted and we're like, we'll repost that or we'll retweet that, you know, like, and then that takes, you know, we haven't posted it, it's not our license to, as the lawyer, it depends, is the answer.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask a little bit more about these release forms and some best practices. So are you collecting contact information when you have these release forms so they can go back to them, follow up if you need to do work and campaign? And also, how are you associating these forms with the photos that they belong to if you don't have digital asset management system in place? And how long are you holding on to these forms?
I can, at least on our end, I can touch a little bit on that. So the way we associate the two together, the way we work is if we're photographing an event or anything, each event gets a unique source number and then iterations after that. And so any model release gets that number to tie that in. So we at least have that link between the PDF and the images, and we can search that way. The PDFs are stored in our digital asset management system along with those images so that at least they're findable that way. They don't always reference which picture it may be, so there is a little bit of work that then has to go into that, that type of work. As far as how long do we keep them? Right now, in theory, in perpetuity, although the way I think most museums work, but certainly the way we work, we're usually looking for the freshest images. So we're typically only looking back, or our communications group, which deals with kind of the social media, it's usually only looking back at the most, maybe 6 months back in time for images, because they really want the freshest, come see this exhibition, or this new installation, or this particular event. So it's easier to kind of keep that material up fresh for us.
So we actually started a new workflow for video, but I'm hoping that we can roll it out to other forms of event photography. And that's where we're organizing things on an event basis. And the staff member that is in charge of the event we also work with them to ascertain what they need in terms of releases and which form is appropriate, because it just seems like, based on the type of event and the type of audience, it's not consistent in terms of what we're told that we need to have. So we work out what's appropriate for that event, and we put all the documentation, the media and the paperwork goes into the electronic folder, and then from there it's going to go into, we don't have a document management system, but we do have a preservation system, Preservica. So we're looking at having all of these assets and their documentation go in one place, and they'll all be associated with one another, and we'll be able to find them in the future. So that's kind of a collaboration between different departments at the center and our archive and rights department.
A low-tech solution that our marketing department is looking at, kind of refreshing their pool of images that they can pull from and do some new photography, hiring outside photographers. And one of the things that they're doing to just kind of make their lives a lot easier is on each form is numbered in big, bold letters in the upper corner. And what they'll do is they'll have them fill out the form, but then take a quick snap of the person holding the form there. And then you at least have that very dumb, stupid, if you need to go back to that event and say, okay, here's the model release, there's that person. You also don't have the, I never signed that, kind of thing too. But more specifically, you at least know, okay, that person, that's their.
Yeah, sometimes the simplest solution is the best one, right?
Except if you are trying to not disrupt the visitor experience, which we have a lot of pressure.
Yeah, in specific situations, and again, you brought up, like, for a small social gathering is very different than a large 100-person.
Yeah,
Sometimes it also comes down to just clever photography. And we try to train our photographers to keep this in mind, that we may not be able to get releases for everyone, so if they can be very strategic in how they capture images. And I know there's a lot of, I don't know a lot about photography, but the time lapse, or people kind of moving swiftly through the image where you don't really see them, but they're moving through the space. We've been using a lot of that recently.
What we just heard about not disrupting the user experience is really critical in all of this, because on the one hand, we want to protect the institution, but on the other hand, we don't want to intrude on the user's experience of the exhibitions. And one thing that comes up that John mentioned is when we mount exhibitions that include loans. And in my mind, most loan agreements include this archaic language about we're lending you this photograph, but it can't be photographed when it's on your site. But to me, the contradiction there is that, the photograph just stays on when it's in my gallery, and that's fine, no problem. But when I give to your gallery, I don't want anyone photographing, and there's just no logic there. And I think it's just in the borrowers, lenders agreements because it is. And I think I've had the experience of just bringing that to the attention of general counsel, bringing that to the attention of the curators and the
Yeah.
deputies. And I think once you point that out to them, they get it. It's like, yeah, that's kind of dumb. However, it's also confusing to visitors who come to the institution or in an exhibition that includes loans. If it's like, well, you can photograph that one, but no, you can't photograph that one, and that one's okay, but not that one. So I just like to put out there that it's a conversation that should happen at every institution. Because if everyone is fine with the idea that you can photograph artworks when it's on loan, then no issue.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it can be quite confusing.
I mean, I echo that entirely. I think that's our biggest problem is with special exhibitions is the loan agreements. There's this language buried in them. And with us, we run into a time crunch with registrars, and they don't have the ability to individually negotiate every one of these agreements. And so we end up locked into things, and we can sometimes then, reapproach the lender, or I've floated the idea of having, our head of exhibitions or our director approach lenders. But I think we all need to kind of speak up about it to make a change, because it really makes no sense at all. And it's tough to not have the time to deal with if you have an exhibition with 40 lenders or something, and where are you? And then it turns out that most of the people at the institution you're borrowing from don't even know that language is in there, and they want to come in and take photographs. So there you are.
It has to be done on the part of the lending institution.
Yeah,
Because it's prohibited.
it does. And I think we bring it up more to our curators and our directors, because that's how, I think a lot of things about thumbnails and fair use, like when AMD took that up a few years ago, or when AMD took up the fact that museums charged each other these reproduction fees that didn't make sense for projects they were collaborating on. So, yeah, I totally agree.
We actually just had the perfect case study of what John was talking about with an old loan form for our current exhibition. Out of all the lenders, only one piece from one lender, they wanted no photography, and it's because they had the option to check yes or no. And the form was so outdated, it's like, can it be used for the World Wide Web? And like, we're all kind of in hindsight looking at it like, this is really old. And we ended up having the curator talk directly to the lender, and they were fine with it. Because otherwise, it just would have been too hard to have one gallery attendant enforce no photos on one piece for the entire exhibition. So yeah, I think we just, in the last few months, we had a perfect case study of why these things need to be revisited.
Well, and to that end, for a project that I'm working on, forthcoming, was in discussions with, just earlier this week, with representatives from another institution that we're looking to collaborate on for an exhibition. And the assistant director of this institution and I went round and round the table talking about allowing visitor photography, and she was standing her ground that if we allow anybody to take pictures and post on social media, then no one's going to come to that exhibition. It is going to completely kill. And I just sat there and was like, I respectfully disagree. And then,
quickly pulled out like what I felt like was my flip chart here of, you know, here are the reasons why you want this engagement and to have this. And she kind of was like, oh, okay. And, you know, understanding like this isn't going to stop people from wanting to actually come and see. It is an amazing way to engage with our visitors and encourage them and get more people and reach a wider audience that may never have come initially, but then they see their friend post something really cool and they go, oh, I want to come see that too. So it's definitely still a conversation that is ongoing, and we need to fight the good fight.
I just want to circle back to the loan agreement, just one more comment. It's not just loan agreements. I find that contracts, even within the institution, we have I work for Albright Knox, and we have a vibrant public art program now. And only recently did I even see the contracts for rights when we were creating new art around the city. And there was a lot of archaic language in there too that basically said we couldn't even do things with the photos that we were taking of art that we were commissioning. So to be aware and speak to all departments and be working out rights at the time where these contracts will be great.
Great point.
I have a direct response to that too. I was just at an archives conference, and a couple archivists with these like donations of things or new things that are created, they said they just changed the default language for the donation to the collection, like what they can do, what license they can put stuff under. And most people don't even notice the change because the default is free and open, right? And so if you give the language of your tools that your institution hands out to others in that default free and open permissive language, whether it's licensing, whether it's, you know, allowed to do certain things with it, most folks won't notice. And so you're not going to have arguments. And when they do notice, it's a good opportunity, like you were saying, to pull out the flip chart and be like, these are all the opportunities for impact when open happens.
And don't be afraid to say no. If somebody sends you a contract, destroy the contract if necessary, and mark it all up and just say, we can't agree with this. Like, we have the power to tell the collections management department, I'm a member of that, I am the curatorial department, so maybe I am a bit of a different person, but I always just say, no, that's not the way that we work. We can say no to the lender, it won't ruin the agreement if we just push back a little bit. Because I've never had anything ruined because of that, so knock on wood.
So we're over time, but I'm not sure that anyone else is in this room after us, so I think are we happy to keep going for a few more minutes? Good. Sure.
And as it circles back to accessibility, and as we, as museums in the United States, are getting more and more international visitors, there are different cultural sort of norms in terms of what's acceptable behavior for taking pictures. And I mean, like, we've had visitors that climb up onto platforms to photograph things. I mean, this is like 20-hour flight, once in a lifetime opportunity to come to this museum, and they want to get the picture. And I'm just wondering how, if at all, are your institutions dealing with sort of visitor manners? I know that some museums in Asia, they give out little brochures with pictographs about what's acceptable, so that even if you don't speak the language, you can kind of get it. I'm just wondering if anybody else is sort of, because we've had a lot of damage that has occurred because there's just different accepted norms of behavior of what you can and can't do in a museum, and so visitors come and they're used to doing things one way and we do it differently, and so I'm wondering if anybody else is sort of addressing that in relationship to the needing to take photographs for social media and keeping things open and yet protecting the artwork.
Yeah, so we run into that a lot. We have a lot of international visitors and a lot of fanatical Warhol fans coming to the museum. And so we explain kind of the basic rules in the photo policy when they're getting their admission ticket. And then we have gallery attendants who are kind of trained on our policies. And they're also trained to kind of engage the visitors to let them know why we have our policies. So like instead of just yelling like, no touching or don't get that close, like they kind of explain, you know, we're stewards of the artwork. It's our goal to keep these items in perpetuity. So we try to engage them in a way that's more positive than kind of saying no, but it's always like, you know, it's always coming up with us of kind of, so we do have a lot of gallery attendants kind of managing the space basically.
A lot of museums are cutting back on security staff.
Yeah.
Because that's sort of the easiest thing. And so then it's like, how do you deal with crowd control
I would just agree that it really comes back to staff education, recurrent training with your own staff, and that's everything from security to guest services, your frontline staff, your retail staff. For us, it's our horticulture staff out in our gardens. Really, anybody that potentially is intersecting and engaging with the public, so that they're aware and that they can feel empowered to interact and talk to those visitors and better inform those visitors. And then, of course, take all the drones away.
Okay, so I guess there is a 4:15 in here, so we'll wrap up. Thank you, everybody.